Stacey Plaskett is a House representative for the U.S. Virgin Islands and joins me now live from Washington, D.C. Representative Plaskett, thank you so much for joining us. We spoke a few months back about this specific mission. Now we have, as we noted, about 200 Kenyan forces there on the ground in Haiti. This is the first of what's expected to be about 2,500 forces and police officers from a variety of other countries, largely coordinated by the United States. First, let me ask you, given what headlines we're seeing specifically in Kenya itself, in Nairobi, the violent protests over that finance bill, do you think that at all will be a distraction here and demoralizing, for lack of a better word, for what this mission is supposed to ensure and bring?
Sure, I don't think so. But of course, I'm not on the ground in Kenya to be fully apprised of that. But I do think that the president of Kenya has done a yeoman's job in terms of showing leadership of Kenya in this area, as well as several others. As you recall, he was in the United States several weeks ago and discussing not just this issue, but trade and others that are plaguing many of our African leaders in terms of finances, as well in terms of economic downturns that are occurring. Kenya is, of course, leading the charge on this multi-state mission to Haiti, but they're not the only one. As you stated, this is a multinational security support mission. It's expected that 2,500 members will be there. Of course, the largest contingent will be Kenyan police officers, but we have commitment from other countries as well, other neighboring Caribbean countries, as well as some African countries and other countries. And of course, the United States is financed the training for the Kenyan police officers that are spearheading this, and we're working and supporting logistics as well as others.
The United States has provided many of the mission supplies, Russian armored vehicles, and other equipment. To list the other countries involved here, that is the Bahamas, Bangladesh, Barbados, Belize, Benin, Chad, Jamaica, and Kenya. Obviously, Kenya being the first on the ground there. Kenyan officials estimate that this will cost roughly $600 million. The UN has agreed to fund this with $21 million. The U.S. agreeing to pledge $300. There's still a deficit there. Are you concerned that this commitment will not get the money that is required to really be as effective as possible?
Sure. There's always a concern, particularly when it comes to African, Caribbean nations, to the other nations who in turn benefited from these nations many years ago, are not doing their fair share to bring them up to equity and to support them in ways that can advance their democracies. After, in many cases, European countries, as well as the United States, having depleted the resources of the countries that are now asking for help. But I think that the President Biden has made a tremendous move by circumventing House Republicans as well as Senate Republicans who are trying not to allow the president to draw this money down. He found other routes to be able to do that, and that speaks so highly of his commitment. And I think that commitment on the part of the United States is going to add pressure, and we will continue to put pressure on our European partners, on others, on Canada, to support this initiative, because a healthy, vibrant, safe Haiti is in the national security interest of us all.
Do we see the imperative from Haitians themselves to really at some point grab the reins here and bring order and democracy back to the country? Even the U.S. ambassador to Haiti said that the Kenyans and others will offer support to the Haitian police, but the goal is to not replace them.
Sure. I think you heard it yourself from the clip that you had just earlier, where it was a Haitian's leadership not talking about what the United States or Kenya or others are doing, but a call to other Haitians. I think that Haiti has done a tremendous job of creating a transitional government in a place of no government, of engaging civil society and other groups, their diaspora, to come to the table and to really think selflessly about how we bring this country forward. The individuals who are doing this transitional government have made commitments themselves that they would not be part of an electoral government when it comes into place, when an election comes up. but are really there just to guide the country. And I think that Haiti has always wanted to be its full self, to be its full independent self, one of the first nations in the region to throw off chattel slavery and be free. But they've been hampered for many years, one by the debt that they've had to pay to France over centuries for that freedom. Imagine paying for your freedom, as well as other impediments and natural disasters that have come at them. And so I think that us using this time, and you think about shock doctrine, in some of the worst times is when we can rebuild. And I think Haiti will need a Marshall Plan in the same way that Europe did after World War II, that then galvanized it to be what it is today. And I think that can be done not only in Haiti, but throughout the Caribbean region.
Even the most optimistic of people watching this do not expect for things to turn around within the next 6 months or so, or even perhaps a year. And I'm asking specifically regarding the politics here in the United States, given that we have an election coming up between most likely former President Trump and President Biden. We know, given his past comments, how former President Trump feels specifically about Haiti. Is there any way for a Trump administration to walk back this verbal and financial agreement that President Biden put in place?
Well, as I said, we saw that in the past, there was funding that was allocated to the State Department for this. However, it needed authorization from the four corners of Congress in terms of the Foreign Affairs Committee, as well as others, Homeland Security, et cetera. And those were being held up by the Republicans. It was President Biden who did the workaround himself, using his executive power to be able to get that money to Haiti. And I think that given what President Trump has said in the past, his reticence and isolationism of the United States, not just in Haiti, but in Europe and other places as well, and individuals who are afraid to go against him, that should he become president, this will be a very difficult task. Things do not change on a dime. Ships don't change on a dime. And definitely the devastation that has occurred in Haiti is not going to happen, as you said so rightly, not in 6 months or even a year. And we've got to be steady and be with them as they work through this to bring the country to where it can be. And I think that that's in the benefit of the United States. I think President Biden, as well as the vice president, who has embarked on a real slew of initiatives in the Caribbean, whether it was to stop drug and gun trafficking in the region, as well as to support energy issues and stop climate change, and even supporting financial sectors and remittances that are of Americans that are of Caribbean descent going into the region to support that with the banks that are there. And I think this wraparound support that we're given, whether it's in trade preferences to the Haitian people, ensuring that their manufacturing that they have been doing can continue, as well as the support that we're giving for stabilization of security. Initially, these forces are going in there to make sure that aid can get to the people of Haiti, but then ensuring that ports as well as airports and important infrastructure is stable.
All right, Representative Plaskett in Washington, D.C., thank you so much for your time and for joining us.
Thank you.